Where are the voices to guide us through these times? The more that I look, I see what must be mine. Say, where are the voices to guide us through these times? The more that I look, I see what must be mine.
I grew up probably about, and I'm going by, when I think of miles as a child in my memory, we went by horse and wagon everywhere. So, my sense of distance, even when I know better, I still, think of that. But I would say it would be about 20 miles, 25 miles west of there. I live not far from the national park border. So I was east of, let's see, I got a thing now. Big River is north, and south Debden. So I lived east of Dumble, at a place called Park Valley. And in the old days, the name of Park Valley, our name for it was Nakiwin, and Nakiwin means the stopping place. And from what my father told me and the old people, that our family was one of the first families, and as far as I know, the first family that was there, that came to Park Valley. It was all forest when we came there, and the trail that goes from Park Valley to Debden was known as the Campbell Trail originally, because my grandfather had helped to cut it. And I don't know at what point that settlers started to move there. I don't know how old I was, because I can't remember that. But I do remember people coming in. We had a lot of people who eventually became our relatives, and were probably our relatives way back, Métis people who came from Willow Bunch area and from Round Prairie, which is not far from Saskatchewan, who came and joined our family. And the Shorts, I believe, were the first people that came to our area. And they came from Round Prairie and Willow Bunch originally, I think, from Willow Bunch to Round Prairie too. But that was a whole area that Métis people wintered. They were buffalo hunters, and it was the area where their relatives, the Cree people, Woodland Cree, came from, that whole thick wood hills area and into the what's today called the Ladder Hills. So the history that I know, the oral history, was from my great-grandmother, my father, and a lot of the old people that I grew up with.
What about, they call it the Ladder Hills?
It's called the Ladder Hills. When my great-grandmother talked about those hills, she always called them Ksenio Spatnawa, which means Old Man Hills. And I don't know if there was another name for them in Cree, but that was what she called them. And my great-grandmother came from her people were the Musaskepos from the what became the Atakakope, or the Sandy Lake First Nations.
Where did you go to school?
I went to school in Park Valley. They had a one-room school about 2 miles east of southeast. I have a hard time with direction from the Park Valley, what used to be the Park Valley store.
What was it like for the social life there?
Well, our social life was within our community with our own people. And then we had my memories of it are really rich and strong. There was a lot of Métis people that lived, Métis and half-breed people, and I say half-breed people because those were the Scottish English half-breeds. The French were the Métis people. So they lived all the way from Debden and between Debden and Big River on that east side, and the the road that goes from Debden to Big River. On both sides of that road there were little road lands. You couldn't really call them communities because they were more family units. We lived in family groups. And also in the area where I come from, there were road lounge communities. And originally, many of the people had homesteads. Well, originally they had script, Métis script, and then those scripts were either stolen or taken from them. A couple of families sold them because they needed money. And then some of the families, after losing their script, when the land was open for homesteading, some of the families took homesteads. And those are families like, I believe, the Goodries and the Shorts and Arcans and people like that. Not all of them, but many of them did. And many of them who had homesteads lost their homesteads because they just didn't have the means to work the land. They didn't have money. They were really poor.
Have you been up there recently to see what?
I go home every summer because we have, the church is there, and that's where my family is buried. And the church is behind what used to be the old cheese factory there. There used to be a cheese factory, a store, and a little cluster of the man who owned the store, his family that lived there, and the old man whose son ran the store had the cheese factory. We always thought they were French because they said they were, and found out that when I was doing research at the Round Prairie Métis settlement that they were Métis. They were French Métis, but they always said they were French.
There was some discussion at some point that some people from the Riel Rebellion area, from the Batoche, went up there as well. Is that?
Oh, that's true. Many of the Métis families that ended up there were families who had been involved in the battle, and they fled to that area where the Prince Albert National Park is, because that was their wintering sites were there, but also they had. There were Cree relatives who were, these were all people that hunted buffalo in the summer. They were related to people in those areas, like their Cree families were there, and they joined them because that was all forest area. There was nobody there except for the indigenous people that lived there. My family on my great grandmother's side were Cree people. They were Cree Métis. They weren't full-blood Cree.
When you talk about the forest, and people refer to the forest, and today, of course, there's a whole concern over the forest being clear-cut. The forest was part of the economy then as well, too?
In the early days, the economy wasn't. We weren't the people who were loggers, but we worked for loggers. That whole area of Park Valley, the old stories from the old people was that it had old-growth forest, and my father used to say that the trees were so huge, and his father was one of the that worked there, said that the trees were so big that 3 men could put their arm around, like standing together, could just barely get around that tree. He said the trees were huge all in through. Now, I can't speak for Dumble area because the stories I have about that were in my area. But in the Dumble, all of that area between, I would say from Dumble all the way to Big River and north, points north, and then toward the park was logged out pretty well. There was lots of logging that was done. And there were people who had small logging companies, like family logging companies, and they'd hire local people. And my family were some of the people that worked in logging. And lots of lumber, like they cut logs for lumber, and like they had sawmills. I'm just trying to remember some of the families that they were, I think, Scandinavian the ones in my area. I don't know what they would have been more toward the Big River area, but I'm sure there must be local histories that were written. I know in the 1960s there was a whole series of oral story projects that were done in that area. I was in the archives digging around when I was working on my my master's, and I wanted to do a history of the area, and I was doing research. I came across a whole box of interviews that had been done in the Park Valley, Lake 4, to the edges of Dumble and that way from the Big River Road, the highway, east toward the park, but mostly in my area, that road that goes from Debden that comes to Park Valley and through Lake 4 and comes out at, what's the name of the, oh my gosh, my COVID memory, but where the festival is.
Ness Creek.
Ness Creek. The road comes out at Ness Creek. That used to be the, that was the other road, the Big River Debden Road, and then this road. And there were settlements of Métis people, these family groups all through there. And so that round trip, we could pretty well visit. We knew everybody, and some of those people were family, or we had married into those families.
With growing up there, your experience, how much of that impacted on what you've done since then in terms of your writing and
well, that's where all of
playwriting?
that's my treasure chest. I mean, that was a very it was an area that was rich in oral tradition. It was rich in land culture. It was rich in language. It had everything except that there was no work for our people. There was nothing, because as I said, our people were buffalo hunters, and they were independent. They were the people that were called the Bamsuak, that means the free people. So we didn't belong to a parish or a fort or anything. Originally, the families were buffalo hunters, and they would make that trek all the way into the, from there, come to Round Prairie and meet up with other buffalo hunters and make these expeditions all the way into Montana through Judith Basin and end up at Pembina, and then come back all the way around. That was done twice a year. This was back in those days when they were still doing buffalo hunting. And they were families who had fled from Batoche, many of them, and had been really involved there, but were scared they were going to be hanged. They ran away from the soldiers, and so there's a lot of history and a lot of their families. Their great grandfathers had been involved in the battle at Batoche. I know that the Vandal family, which is my on my grandmother's side, and some of them lived around Dumble and Bodmin in that area. Their families, our great grandfather on that side had been a part of the battle at Batoche. And my mother's family on the Morset side, which is the family that Jesse Thistle comes from, that was they were also involved in the battle at Batoche. Those families, they were the Montours and other families that they were related to, and so there's lots of really rich oral stories in that community. And I'm 82, so I mean I was really privileged to growing up with those stories. It got really bad as we got older, the community, because we were landless people to start with. We had been, that was our traditional territories, and the traditional territory for sure of our grandmother's people. But once settlement started, there was a big, huge move to get people off of the land, and that was done in all sorts of ways. So it was kind of like, you can't really blame it on one thing, because it was a whole lot of things. Just like today, it's never done with one thing. when you dispossess people, you come at them from all angles and all sorts of ways. But poverty was certainly one of the main things, because there was no work. Once all of the roots and the rocks and the land had been cleared, because they worked for settlers to clear the land. Once all of that was done, there was no place for us. And after buffalo hunting, people had been trappers and hunters, and they couldn't do that anymore because the land was settled, and you just couldn't go hunting wherever you wanted. So there was not very much, and in those days there was no such thing as welfare or anything like that. So people, again, I feel really privileged because I come from people who were independent and worked hard. When settlers say they worked hard, I believe me, Métis Road-Lounge communities worked hard to survive. And remembering what a road lounge is there's this continual moving. So a lot of Métis people who lived on road lounges would stay maybe in Dumble for a couple of years, and they'd move to Park Valley for a couple of years. That way you could kind of keep the authorities away. Yeah? And it was also a way that you would just go from family to family and help. And you might have family that homesteaded, they had land, but that didn't mean that you had land. There are examples, and I won't name families, but there are families in that whole area between Park Valley and Dumble area, that whole area, where there were people who lived in small groups in road lounges, but they might have a family member that had a homestead there, and so they would stay close to relatives.
There was a story of a ghost herd of buffalo.
Mm-hmm. I know that was, and I don't know if it's the same herd, but this is going way back to when buffalo were first put into that park, that there were some people from our community and from a couple of other communities that cut the wire and let those go, because I said these were old buffalo hunters, and buffalo shouldn't be kept. But at the same time, when you look at the history of buffalo in pens, it was also a Métis man who fought really hard and long to make sure that buffalo were preserved, and worked and negotiated with government to do that. And somebody is now working on publishing a book of his history. And I'll think of his name before we get finished, but I can't think of it right now.
I just want to go back to something. When you think of the past being related, of course, to tree cutting, for logging, and now you have these large companies coming in, and they want to really do a major clear cut. Mm-hmm. What's the difference between?
Well, I think the difference. I mean, when I think of it, but at the same time, I also believe that we need to acknowledge our history. The people who had small, they logged with horses and they had sawmills. It started out with clearing the land. People, settlers came and had to clear their land, but because the trees were so rich, a lot of people set up these sawmills. So it was a way of earning a living, usually for a family, and they would hire local people to do logging. And it was some of the work that my family did. And I think it was either Erickson's or Swanson's, I can't remember, who had a small sawmill, and my family, my dad and my uncles would go in and work there sometime. I think that's who they were, but they were Scandinavian people who lived along the Sturgeon River. One of them had a sawmill in that area. Now, if he had a sawmill much later, I can't remember, but he did have a sawmill when I was a little girl. And I remember that because he lost his arm, or his son lost his arm in the sawmill, so I never forgot that. Mm. And I must have been probably about 3 or 4 when, I guess I barely remember it. But it was, people were earning a living. It was, like gardening, except that the big trees got clear cut, and those were bigger logging companies that came and did that. And I know that I saw all of the photographs in the archives, photographs of those big trees and logging companies, but they were again the logging was done with horses, and that's the same kind of logging that was done in BC, except there was much bigger industry, and you know, from there, many of those people, they hunted and trapped. They worked for settlers picking rocks and stones and brushing, but they also would work as loggers. So for my people, it was part of the work that we did to survive. And for the people who had logging, little logging businesses, those were settlers, and they were people that were earning making a family income, a small income. Big difference from corporations who don't, the community is of no importance to them, and they're just cutting. They're cutting, where the old kind of logging, according to my dad, was like harvesting. You didn't go out and clear cut. You selected your land because you had to think about that land 10 years from now, you were going to live there. So the only land that was clear cut was the land that they were going to farm. So they would clear cut that, and then our people would come along and they'd do the stumping and cutting of the brush that was there, and then the land would be seeded. But even that didn't really happen. They didn't hire a lot of people until probably in the 1930s, because there just wasn't, nobody had money. Settlers, when they first came, didn't have much money. So any hiring that was done was an exchange of work for food, grain, things like that. It was always, in the beginning, exchanges, which was, created a different kind of relationship when people exchange their labor, because I remember my dad again and my family telling me about trading with the local farmer or the local settler who would grind grain to feed his animals and use it for flour and porridge or whatever, like they ate for breakfast food, and our family cutting brush for him to trade so that we'd have enough flour and grain, grains to eat until over the winter. So lots of trades were made in the early days, and then once people started to hire, then the relationship between Indigenous community and settler community changed. And then once it became, the big farms or bigger farmers came, and then it totally changed.
Where are the voices to guide